The deepest cave on Earth is the Veryovkina Cave, measuring 7,157 feet. The cave is so deep that accessing its vast depth requires thousands of feet of rope and more than 4 days. And really, without a few terrifying occurrences, what would the deepest cave be? Today on Terminal Defect, we will uncover the mystery behind the Veryovkina Cave incidents. Abkhazia, a Georgian territory, is home to the world's 4 deepest caverns. One of these is the Veryovkina Cave. A portion of it was discovered in 1968, with deeper sections revealed following intense research in 2000, confirming that it was indeed the deepest cave on Earth. Its maximum discovered depth is 2,212 meters, which is tremendous. It's difficult to comprehend the depth of this cave. It actually is. For context, that's the same as stacking 23 Statue of Liberties on top of one another. The entrance of Veryovkina Cave is similarly at an elevation of 7,500 feet, which means you must climb a veritable mountain to get there. Once you're up there, you're still surrounded by the mountain range's stony cliffs, and in the middle of these rocks is a quite unremarkable-looking hole in the earth. It's evident that it's the entrance to a cave, but you never anticipate it to fall more than a mile into the ground. When cavers discovered the opening in 1968, they barely descended 377 feet before returning to the surface. Then, in 1983, the cave was discovered for a second time by a separate team of speleologists from the Veryovkina Club from Moscow. Over the next 3 years, a series of expeditions pushed the depth to around 1,400 feet. But then, for reasons that are unclear, there were no more expeditions until the year 2000. In September 2018, the Veryovkina team returned to continue exploring the cave, this time accompanied by photographers Robbie Schoen and Jeff Wade. This expedition, led by team leader Pavel Demidov, would return to the bottom of Veryovkina Cave to collect samples of some of the potentially undiscovered species and explore some of the cave's promising horizontal passages, all while Robbie and Jeff documented everything. In enormous caves like Veryovkina Cave, the descent is more akin to an excursion you'd expect to see while climbing a tall mountain. If you've ever seen anything about Mount Everest, you may have heard of the multi-camp system. These camps are built higher and higher up the mountain to store food and gear, and to allow climbers to sleep and rest in between climbs. The amount of gear becomes considerably too big to carry at one time for multi-day treks on a mountain or in a sufficiently deep cave. Veryovkina Cave is no exception, requiring people to ascend and descend beforehand in order to transfer load after load of the required equipment to guarantee a safe attempt. It has a total of 6 camps at various depths on the way to the bottom. After that, they go through a number of narrow passageways and tunnels as they make their way to the first camp at 2,000 feet by descending the first shaft into the darkness. This camp is permanently set up, with supplies and equipment kept on site all year round in case of emergency. Then Robbie, Jeff, and the Veryovkina Club descended all the way to Camp 6 at 6,900 feet over the course of the following 4 days. The temperature was barely above freezing as they set out. They wriggled through water and mud, squeezed through impossible spaces, and dropped over 100 feet of airless shaft. Their only methods of entry and exit were the thousands of feet of ropes that they utilized to accomplish the descent. Finally, they entered Camp 6, which was situated on a huge horizontal tunnel and was sandy and level. For the duration of the trip, this would serve as their residence. The team left their camp throughout the course of the following 3 days to finish all of the tasks they had planned. Taking Robbie and Jeff to the lake at the bottom was one of these. They were astounded to find stunning blue water encircled by jet black limestone when they arrived. The lake is actually 28 feet deep, 50 feet long, and 25 feet broad. It would be completely colorless and in utter darkness if they hadn't brought the lights. Even on day 7, everything was proceeding as planned. Additionally, 2 crew members had to depart early that day in order to catch their flight home. When they got up to Camp 3, there was a ton of water pouring into the cave. A massive storm up on the surface had caused a flood pulse to send thousands of liters of water rushing in. Because of the thick layers of rock, wireless communication is not actually possible inside these caves. Consequently, In order to communicate, cavers must physically run a queue the whole length of the cave. As soon as possible, the two team members used the wire to alert the others to the impending flood pulse. When they received the call at Camp 6, they weren't very concerned. One of the common concerns for cavers is flood pulses. 1 square kilometer receives 1,000 liters of water from a single milliliter of rainfall, which is equivalent to 1 liter per square meter. That number is much greater with heavy rain. All of this water then bursts down into caves in equally huge volumes and can last for hours, depending on the volume of rain and how long it rains for. Once more, when they originally received the call, they weren't overly concerned. The renowned Veryovkina group's strategy was to keep an eye on the water level and make adjustments as needed. Additionally, Camp 6 had been established in what appeared to be a location away from the water's flow off of the main vertical shaft. The depth was over 1,700 feet, although it was also at 6,900 feet. The water would have to fill in passageways beneath them for 300 feet before it could get to them. The first indication of water arriving was heard by them about 30 minutes after they received the call. It started off as a faint rumble and slowly grew like a train approaching. By the time it was just about to reach the camp, it was so roaring loud that it was almost deafening. The entire cave shook like a constant earthquake was going on. Robbie and the others hurriedly emerged from their tents to observe the storm that was swiftly approaching, having just begun his meal when the real commotion began. A fire hose of water came gushing down as they directed their headlights towards the vertical shaft. Robbie had some food in his hand and stood there staring with his mouth agape. Robbie was particularly worried about the amount and speed of water pouring in because he was not nearly as experienced as the Veryovkina team. Once more, though, the area they were in was totally dry, so he made an effort to maintain his composure like his Russian allies. One of the crew members heard a gurgling sound emanating from a small hole close to the tent around 2 hours into the flooding, and there were no signs that it would stop. Even though he couldn't see any water in the hole, he reasoned that he should nonetheless report the situation to the team leader. Pavel thought this was a little worrying, so they went to investigate how much the water table had risen by looking at a nearby siphon. After circling back for almost 5 minutes, they glanced at the hole once more. Not only was there water visible this time, but it was also rising so quickly that it was sloshing against the walls and nearly out of the hole. The team member looked back at Robbie, and Robbie saw that his face had gone completely white. Immediately, he knew that this meant that they needed to leave right away. Robbie and Jeff pulled on their latex suits over their fleece-based layer. After that, they slipped on their abrasion-resistant nylon shells and harnesses. Robbie then made the tough decision to leave all of his camera equipment and personal items, literally tens of thousands of dollars of equipment. He knew he couldn't risk being slowed down, or it could cost him his life or the life of one of his teammates. He pulled all of the memory cards out of the cameras, placed them in a Ziploc bag, and then slipped them into his latex suit. At the very least, he could save all of the pictures he had taken. He then signaled to the others that he and Jeff would begin their climb, and they began by making their way down the vertical shaft that led out of the rapidly filling Camp 6. This would be the end of their communication with the Russians at Camp 6. Before beginning their ascent, the remaining members of the Veryovkina team would wait for Pavel, the team leader. Robbie stepped into the waterfall pouring down from the shaft and clipped his ascenders to the rope. Then he put his head down, took a deep breath, and started making his way up the rope as the water pummeled him from above. The water was coming down so hard, it felt like it was crushing and suffocating him. It was literally as if his head was being squashed into his shoulders. Thankfully, he was able to tuck his chin, which allowed the water to run off his helmet and create a small air pocket for him to breathe. Focusing on just the white rope directly in front of his face, he moved his ascenders up rhythmically as fast as he could. Finally, he reached an area with a small outcropping that he could step on and out of the waterfall to look up. He saw that the rope was coming out of a shoulder-sized hole in the rocks, but this was also the source of the water. Coming out of this little hole was a fire hose of water that seemed to take up the entire space. He thought to himself that there was no way he was going to be able to make it through that intense downpour. At the same time, he couldn't just stop. He was the lead climber. Everyone else was coming up behind him, and there was no telling what the waiter was like down below. He had to at least try to make it through. When he got to the hole, the force of the water was so strong that he was only able to push his ascenders a couple inches at a time. He finally made it through the squeeze, and then realized that Jeff would have to do the same thing. He had no idea whether or not Jeff would be able to make it, so he just kept climbing as high as he could to get out of the way. In his panic, he hadn't realized that this new section of the cave was mostly dry. The water flowed down a different route to the squeezy, so he was relatively safe where he was. But because he was so full of adrenaline, he was mindlessly climbing for his life as fast and as high as he could. He only finally realized what he was doing when Jeff yelled out to him to slow down. Snapping out of it, he stopped and waited for Jeff to catch up before they continued. When Jeff reached him, his face was pale, his eyes wide, but he exclaimed they were alive. Robbie and Jeff made it to Camp 5 at 6,200 feet, where they waited, hoping to see the Russians soon. Miraculously, they spotted Andrei's headlamp slowly ascending. After Andrei reached camp, he shook his head silently when asked about the others. Down below, the bridge had submerged, forcing the team to swim to the ropes. As Pavel returned, the chamber turned into a swirling vortex, making escape difficult. Eventually, 5 more lights emerged from the depths. All remaining members of the Perovo team ascended to Camp 5, impressing Robbie with their strength and capability. One member even carried a stovey and 4 sleeping bags. Robbie was relieved he and Jeff had gone first, as they might not have survived otherwise. Upon reaching camp, they laughed about the ordeal, but Robbie remained anxious, refusing to remove his gear and constantly checking for rising water. A horizontal passage 200 feet above them was normally half filled with water, but now completely flooded. They hoped the water wouldn't rise further. Pavel reassured Robbie they would wait for the water to clear in the morning. Over the next 16 hours, the water's roar diminished as the flood pulse, caused by a week of rain and a severe storm, subsided after 20 hours. When the storm arrived, the ground was completely saturated from the previous week's rain, and water was pouring into Veryovkina Cave non-stop. A cab driver later told them that the storm had left nickel-sized raindrops behind. For the crew, this was actually a worthwhile learning experience. Previously, they had been working on the assumption that there was just winter flooding in the cave. Plans were made to enhance surface monitoring to observe rain after the expedition. In case of floods, an additional camp was set up in the lower chambers to serve as a backup escape route. And even though their excursion was cut short, they had accomplished almost all of their goals. All the photos had survived despite the destruction of the camera equipment. New passageways had been discovered and plotted, and species found within the cave had been sampled. However, there will be more mishaps in Veryovkina Cave in the future. A rope that was fastened at the cave's entrance was discovered by some persons who were investigating the region in November 2020, 2 years later. In the world of caving, this is usually a big no-no because anyone can enter the cave and, if they're not prepared, could be hurt or lost. On August 4th, 2021, 8 months later, the same Perovo crew came back to carry out more work at Veryovkina Cave. Following their descent into the cave from 3 years prior, they discovered an ice axe and a pair of crampons at an elevation of 1,300 feet. This was not logical. It is hardly possible that this equipment simply fell from the cave's entrance. To the location of the equipment, there were no straight drops. This implied that someone had to have entered the cave and gone a long way inside. Exhausted and cold, Sergei likely succumbed to hypothermia as he attempted to find a way out. His body was discovered in the cave, highlighting the dangers of solo exploration in remote and treacherous environments. It's unclear exactly what happened in Sergei's last moment, but it seems as though he realized that he wouldn't be able to descend any further through the water with the equipment he had. At which point, he would have tried to make his way back up the cave, but because he had already descended into a technically challenging area, he was unable to get back out. That's all from Terminal Defect. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification for more amazing content. Thanks for watching.